Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the California Emerging Technology Fund, leaders in the quest for digital equity. The James Irvine Foundation, committed to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. And The Wonderful Company. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Harris Ranch Inn and Restaurant and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. Well, here are some interesting statistics. 8 out of the 10 largest wildfires in the state have occurred in the last 5 years, including the 2017 Thomas Fire and the 2021 Dixie Fire, both caused by utilities. Since 2015, power lines have caused almost a third of the state's most destructive wildfires. There are still nearly 40,000 miles of bare power lines in high-threat areas. And finally, if we don't address this problem, the average burn area by wildfires will increase by 63% by the end of the century. There are 2 California state agencies that are responsible for regulating and maintaining our electrical grid. They are the California Public Utilities Commission, or PUC, and the Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety. The question is, have they done enough to get utilities to make the necessary improvements to the electrical grid? A recent report by the California State Auditor's Office seems to suggest not. Our guest is Michael Tilden. He's the California State Auditor, and he's here to discuss that very report. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So listen, we're all aware of the threat of wildfires in California. How can we not be, right? But can you talk a little bit about the sheer magnitude of the fires that it's having on the state budget, on our economy, and on the environment?
Sure. Yeah, definitely. They've been having a significant effect in terms of on the state's finances. I mean, we looked at the expenditures for CAL FIRE and found that they've nearly doubled from 1.9 billion to over 3.5 billion between fiscal year 16-17 and 2021. So that's pretty significant. Just CAL FIRE's expenditures alone, doubling in that short amount of time. But we also found that there are additional costs beyond those costs to suppress the fires. More than 200 people died in some of these fires over the last 6 years, and they've destroyed more than 53,000 structures. So in some ways, it's difficult to quantify all the costs related to these fires.
And not even counting really the environmental costs. I mean, everybody knows when there's wildfire season and the smoke, and that can't be good for folks. I mean, obviously, that's a whole other thing to try to calculate that. So big costs here. So your report notes the role of this wildland urban interface you refer to as having increasing the risk of wildfires and the damage that they're causing. How big a problem is that interface? And what responsibility, if any, do utilities have for increasing wildfire risk as a result?
Yeah, as you said, I mean, just over the last 6 or 7 years, power lines have caused 6 of the state's 20 most destructive wildfires. And a lot of these fires are resulting from vegetation that's contacting power lines, causing sparks. And to a certain extent, some of that is preventable because these power lines, oftentimes in high threat areas, are bare power lines, so they're unprotected. And also, when we look at just the movement in California's population, we now have about 11 million people that live in areas where there's wildlife vegetation.
Yeah, so yeah, all big issues. Now we've got state agencies that are there to regulate this, right? We've talked about earlier, the California PUC, Public Utilities Commission, and this Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety. What is their role in minimizing wildfire risks by utilities?
Sure. So the CPUC, they have a couple of important functions. One, they have to review it's called the general rate case, but basically they have to review the costs that these investor-owned utilities are going to pass on to ratepayers. They also have responsibilities in terms of enforcing maintenance and operation of facilities and ensuring that the electrical system is safe. Energy Safety Office has some really important responsibilities in terms of issuing these safety certifications. And one of the key parts of that is Energy Safety Office has to approve these wildfire mitigation plans that the utilities put together.
Yeah, and those are obviously very, very important. We're going to talk a little more about them later. But I want to ask you something about these shutoffs. Something we've seen a lot more recently in the last few years, these power shutoffs to prevent wildfires by these utilities. It's happening now, if my math is correct, at a rate of almost 7 a year, affecting 3.6 million people. So why do utilities resort to this strategy?
Basically, they're resorting to the strategy because the electrical system, the grid, has not been protected. I think, as you mentioned before, as of July of last summer, these investor-owned utilities have nearly 40,000 miles of power lines in high fire threat areas in the state of California, and more than half of those power lines are bare, unprotected lines. And so, because of that, utilities are having to go with these public safety power shutoffs, really as a last resort measure to try to prevent wildfires.
Yeah, it's just amazing to me that there are 40,000 miles of these bare lines in high risk areas. It's like you're almost asking for a problem, frankly. So let me ask you this, though. There obviously are benefits to shutting off the power in these high risk areas to reduce the wildfire risks, but there's also got to be costs. So how are these shutoffs of electrical power, besides just being an inconvenience, how are they harmful to local communities?
Well, obviously, there's lots of people, residents in the state of California, that rely on that power. And these are people that have medical conditions, and to have their electricity go out sometimes when we looked at the public safety power shutoffs that occurred, as you said, from I think 2013 through 2021, they affected 3.6 million customers. And on average, each one of those events lasted for 40 hours. So if you're someone that relies on that electricity to power medical equipment, emergency equipment, communications equipment, that's quite a hardship.
Yeah, no question about it. Well, up next, we're going to talk about ignoring improvements to the electrical grid by utilities. Has that exacerbated the problem? Has it made it worse? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. Shutting down the electrical power grid is one short-term fix to wildfire risks. But what about a longer-term fix? Something like hardening the electrical grid. A recent report by the California State Auditor's Office suggested there's more that utilities can do to better safeguard the electrical grid. The report also called out state agencies and their role in keeping utilities accountable for their mitigation efforts. We're talking with California State Auditor Mike Tilden about that very report. So one of the things we talked about earlier, and I want to kind of follow up on, is this issue of bare power lines. And you indicate in your report that's a major threat for our electrical systems and causing these wildfires. Can you go in a little more detail of what exactly they are and what role they play in terms of increasing the threat of wildfires?
Sure. The issue there is that these investor-owned utilities have 40,000 miles of power lines in high fire threat areas. And more than half of those, 54% of those lines, are bare lines. These are just bare lines. They're not underground. They're not covered lines. For example, 80% of PG&E's power lines in high fire threat areas are bare lines. And so this is a problem because in windy conditions, when there are wildfires, there are opportunities for trees and vegetation to contact these bare lines and spark fires.
Yeah, really problematic. Your report suggests that hardening projects can help mitigate the threat of these bare power lines. Can you describe us kind of what are they and how effective are they at reducing the risks?
Yeah, there's three key things there. One is this idea of hardening the grid. There's different options there. I think the ideal is to underground these lines, to bury them under the ground. That's the safest. It's also the most expensive. The next option is to cover the lines with some sort of a sheathing. That's very effective and it's very cost effective. The other part that's related to that is doing a better job of trimming and removing trees and other vegetation from around these lines.
Yeah, the problem though is the effect that this is having on ratepayers, right? I mean, if you do all these things, and undergrounding you talk about is very expensive. I mean, it's the safest, but it's also very expensive, and that cost got to be paid by somebody, probably the ratepayers, and ratepayers probably don't really want to do that. And then hardening the lines, providing insulation on the lines is another approach. But you also suggest in your report something called microgrids and sectionalizing devices as improvements that utilities can make to reduce these power shutoffs. Can you briefly describe those mitigation practices and how exactly do they work?
Sure. I mean, they're basically both of what the idea behind both of those is that it's ways of setting up the grid where you're using microgrids or these sectionalizers where if there's an event, if you have a tree or something that sparks a fire from the power line, you can shut down smaller portions of the grid. That's really the whole idea, so that you're mitigating the effect on users.
I was thinking when I was reading that, being a lawyer, think about what's called severability clauses you see in contracts, right? Which says, well, if this one clause is not working, the rest of the contract still is enforced. And in some ways, this is utility equivalent, right? You do is, okay, if this one segment isn't working or high risk, we turn that off, but it allows the rest of the system to work, which seems just, to make common sense, frankly.
Exactly. But I will point out that, at least in our opinion, these are short-term fixes.
Right.
Really, the root cause is dealing with those bare lines.
Yeah, but I did want to ask you a little bit about this. In January 2022, the state passed these new shutoff reduction law. I'm just wondering, what did it do, and how can it be improved?
Basically, what it does is it requires utilities to identify the circuits that are frequently de-energized during these power shutoffs. But what it says is it's asking the utilities to come up with a plan to sort of mitigate the need for these power shutoffs. But we think the law could be strengthened to require these utilities to identify mitigation measures that would actually prevent the need for these power shutoffs, as opposed to mitigating the need.
Right. Being proactive instead of reactive. Right. Which obviously it makes more sense probably on every level, right? It's cost savings and better for the consumer, customer, et cetera. Up next, we're going to talk about the legislative efforts to hold utility companies accountable for their power shutoffs, but also state agencies. Are they doing enough to ensure that these changes that the legislature has enacted are actually being implemented? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. The State Energy Safety Office has the responsibility of issuing these things called safety certifications for utilities when they meet certain criteria. One of the requirements is that they have a mitigation plan. Has this office oversight of, have they ensured implementation of those mitigation plans when they're issuing these safety certifications? We are now talking with Michael Tilden. He's the California State Auditor, whose office recently examined that question, among others. So Mike, these safety certifications are one way that the state can ensure that utilities are actually following, state regulations. What can you tell us about these safety certifications, and what does the utility have to do to get one?
So these safety certifications are very important to the utilities because one thing that they do is they provide a mechanism for putting a cap on the costs of any wildfires that the utilities cause. In 2019, the legislature created this wildfire fund. It's supposed to be a more cost-effective method than insurance to pay for the damage resulting from utility-caused fires. But basically, to get one of these safety certifications, there's certain requirements that utilities must meet, including having an approved mitigation plan.
Yeah, and there are a few other things too. I mean, got to be in good standing in terms of the findings that there's a safety culture assessment, if applicable. And there's a number of things that utilities have to do that some agencies should be looking over their shoulder to make sure they're doing. Let me ask you this: having and implementing mitigation plans appear to be essential to these safety certifications. Your office found that the State Energy Safety Office issued these safety certifications despite the fact that there were deficiencies in the utilities mitigation plan. Is this just a situation with smaller utilities just making kind of some minor errors?
Well, I mean, these are large utilities that we're talking about here, and you're correct that the Energy Safety Office, actually at the time, back in 2020, the first go round of these mitigation plans, it was the CPUC's Wildfire Safety Division, and they did note some deficiencies in the mitigation plans that utilities provided in 2020, but they basically issued conditional approvals of those mitigation plans that ultimately led to the issuance of safety certifications.
Yeah, and some of these, what I was reading in your report, is some of these are what they're called Class A deficiencies. That doesn't sound good. That sounds bad. A in this situation is not good. That's a bad. Those seem to be pretty serious violations. But you were talking about these conditionally approved safety certifications. So it sounds like, okay, they're conditionally approved. That's not a problem as long as they fix whatever the condition is of the approval. They don't get their certification until it's approved. Is that the way it works?
That's not how it worked out for those 2020 mitigation plans. Even though some of these things received conditional approval and the utilities were required to submit remedial plans, once they got the conditional approval, that was the same as getting an actual approval of their mitigation.
So there's no difference between getting regular approval and conditional approval?
Not in 2020. There was no difference.
Yeah, that seems to be problematic because the whole point of conditional is to fix whatever the problem is. So, right. So the record of past compliance and implementation in these mitigation plans, does that have any impact on whether a utility has issued a new certification plan? In other words, is past prologue, I guess. Is failure to implement prior mitigation plans a factor that's being considered when a utility is up for one of these new safety certifications?
Right. That's an area where we think the law really needs to be changed, because unfortunately the criteria in law is that the utility has to have a current mitigation plan that they're in the process of implementing. So I think common sense would tell you that that energy safety should be able to look at the utility's past mitigation plans and whether or not they actually did what they said they were going to do. But right now, Energy Safety Office cannot use the implementation of those past plans as really criteria for approving a safety certification.
Yeah, that seems frankly crazy. That they're only looking forward; they're not looking at what someone did in the past. I think you at that, it seems to me kind of important. But
Right.
one of the things that the director of that office said was, "Hey, we don't want to do that because that's kind of punitive, and we want to be kind of we don't want to be punitive. We want this to be punishment. We'll get more cooperation from utilities if we're not that way." I mean, do you buy that argument?
I don't really think it makes sense. I mean, to me, these safety certifications are very important. They, in some ways, can cap the costs of utilities if they cause fires. And these mitigation plans are really important. But the problem is, so far, the energy safety is not ensuring that the utilities are prioritizing their mitigation activities, number one. And secondly, they're not ensuring that the utilities actually complete the mitigation efforts in their plan. So it doesn't make sense to issue safety certifications without doing those two things.
That seems to be pretty critical. You hit your two very, very important issues that really should be addressed. Well, up next, issuing safety certifications prematurely is one thing, but what if the basis for the safety certification, the mitigation plan itself, has some shortcomings? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Michael Tilden. He's California State Auditor, about a report his office recently did about the state's oversight of the utilities' efforts to mitigate the risk of wildfires. Their finding basically was the state's efforts need improvement. So you were talking about in your report about the two main agencies that deal with oversight in this area. One is something called the Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety, small agency, and second, the California PUC, much larger agency. They're supposed to hold these utilities accountable for following their mitigation plans. The question is that happening? So first, let's talk about that smaller agency, the Energy Safety Office. What did you find?
So the key there is with the Energy Safety Office, we found that they're approving the utilities' mitigation plans, even though those utilities often aren't demonstrating that they're prioritizing their mitigation efforts. In other words, their mitigation plans really don't map out a risk-based approach that they use to identify the highest risk areas and coming up with mitigation efforts that are responsive to those risks. But in spite of that, the Energy Safety Office has approved these mitigation plans anyway. And as I think I mentioned earlier, the other issue there is that the Energy Safety Office is really not, when they're looking at each utility's efforts to implement their mitigation plan, they're not taking that into consideration when they later approve the safety certification.
It just kind of seems incredible. And your report indicate that, for example, in 2021, PG&E's mitigation plans that 80% of their hardening of these utility transmission lines would occur in high-risk areas. Makes a lot of sense. In reality, only 22% did. So that's not a passing grade. Let me ask you this. What is your office recommending that Energy Safety Office do to improve its oversight of utilities then in terms of mitigating wildfire risks?
A couple things there related to the mitigation plans. One of the key things is that we're recommending that Energy Safety designate this prioritization of mitigation activities as what they would call a critical issue. In other words, by calling this a critical issue, that means that utilities have to address the prioritization of their mitigation activities in order for Energy Safety to actually approve the mitigation plan. The other thing is we're recommending that wildfire mitigation plans should be more responsive to the results of any external reviews or audits that are conducted. In other words, to the extent that there are external players that identify deficiencies or risks, these utilities should address that in their mitigation plans.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that. What are these external reviews? And I know you want them to play a role in oversight, but what exactly are they?
For example, up until January of this year, there was a federal monitor that was regularly reviewing and assessing PG&E's wildfire mitigation efforts. So they had a number of findings, they raised a number of issues, and you would think that PG&E would basically include those issues in their mitigation plans and talk about their efforts to mitigate those risks or concerns, but they're not required to do that.
Yeah, it's the other thing you talk about is prioritizing, right? I mean, not every risk is as big as another risk. And so put your money on the biggest risk with the biggest return on investment for ratepayers, by the way, and also for safety in terms of for the state in terms of wildfires. Let me ask you about the larger, more well-known PUC, Public Utilities Commission. How can they do a better job in your view?
So PUC is responsible for conducting audits of the utilities, and basically they're conducting these audits to determine whether the utilities are in compliance with various rules and regulations related to the safe operation of the electrical grid. The problem is these audits are supposed to occur once every 5 years, but CPUC hasn't been doing that. They haven't audited every single utility's complete service area every 5 years, but more importantly, they're not prioritizing their service areas. In other words, they're not prioritizing their audits in high fire threat areas. And because of that, for example, there are some areas in the area of Butte, Shasta, and Tehama counties, for example, where the Camp and Dixie fires occurred, that had not been audited in the last 5 years. And you would have think that CPUC would have prioritized those areas.
Yeah, and there's a requirement that they're supposed to be audited every 5 years, and your report indicates that only 70% of the time that's happening. There's a lot that aren't being audited on that 5-year cycle, which is really problematic. So it sounds to me like you think that the state legislature needs to step in here. About 30 seconds left, but I want to get your answer in terms of what do you think the state legislature ought to be doing?
Right. We have a recommendation that the legislature really requires CPUC to create a risk-based audit plan where they would prioritize the high-risk areas and the high fire threat areas and conduct those audits first, but also get through all these audits every 5 years as required. The other thing I didn't mention is CPUC is not doing a good job of penalizing utilities when they find violations, and we think the legislature should require them to apply a schedule of penalties for any violations they find.
Yeah, it's called consequences. I want to thank Michael Tilden, who's California State Auditor, for joining us. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thank you for joining us.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.